Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callahan. Seattle's PayUp law to raise wages for app-based delivery drivers went into effect just a few months ago. So why does the City Council want to change it?
Thousands of workers have contributed to the development of the PayUp policies.
The Council passed PayUp in 2022 to increase wages for drivers on delivery apps like DoorDash. But some workers say since the rollout of PayUp in January of this year, it's been a pay cut instead.
I feel like my income has been taken away from me.
In 2023, I was receiving 250 offers per week. After PayUp, I'm receiving less than 50 per week.
When the law took effect, the app companies tacked on a $5 delivery fee in Seattle, which many local eateries say has led to fewer orders and a major drop in profits.
I urge the Council to take swift action to prevent more irreversible economic damage to the restaurant industry in Seattle.
I am driven by a sense of urgency that we do something right now.
Council President Sara Nelson has proposed cutting back on hourly and per-mile pay rates for drivers in an effort to get workers more work and help restaurants, and to encourage app companies to drop their $5 surcharge.
The fees will not go away with passing this ordinance.
Where's your sense of loyalty anyway? With your constituents or with these multi-billion-dollar tech giants?
Critics, even some restaurants, say the council is giving away too much to the app companies, with only a few months of data to rely on.
Do not roll back wages. Instead, rein in corporate greed, please.
Will overhauling the new PayUp law help or hurt Seattle's economy?
What we have in front of us is going to be the worst pay standard for gig workers in the country, and I quite frankly think that we deserve a lot better.
Our panel weighs in.
It's not cutting worker pay from before, it's actually going to increase worker pay from before.
Buckle up for a debate over delivery dollars, next on City Inside Out. And joining us to discuss this matter further, we have with us Danielle Alvarado, Executive Director of Working Washington, which helped craft the PayUp legislation passed in 2022, which is the law that's getting changed here. Danielle, very good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We also have with us Michael Wolf, Executive Director of Drive Forward, an app workers group that has received funding from Uber, helped shape the new legislation the council is working on. Michael, good to see you too.
Thanks for having us.
All right. I wanted to begin the show by airing a bit more of the City Council testimony from workers who've spoken out about PayUp over the last few weeks. Here are a few excerpts.
The volume of orders that restaurants receive through third-party apps has been cut in half. That also means my opportunities to deliver have been cut in half. In practice, I've averaged $11.37 an hour since January 13th. That's a far cry from the law's promised minimum $26.40. This law needs to change to restore order volume. To wait any longer is reckless.
Seattle made history when we became the first major city to raise the minimum wage with the Fight for 15, but now that a real livable minimum wage is extended to delivery gig workers, the council seems to want to make history again by being the first major city to remove a minimum wage from tens of thousands of workers. Seeing what potential proposals the council is considering, it is clear that they are listening to lobbying groups funded by Uber and DoorDash rather than the workers themselves.
In listening to the testimony so far, a majority of workers have opposed making changes to PayUp. A majority of restaurants have supported making some changes. And Michael, let me go to you first here. You have lobbied the council to make these changes to PayUp. Before we get into the weeds of what actually will get modified here, why does PayUp need to change in the first place?
Well, so I think one of the things to keep in mind is, our organization, we have 2,000 members who are gig workers across the state. And what we heard from our members after the PayUp law went into effect is what Jason sort of alluded to here, that restaurant orders really fell off a lot. 50% is around the average. Some restaurants reported more, some reported a little bit less. But if you're losing that much orders, that means you're not going to be making, as Jason said, the $26.40 that PayUp promised. And our organization has always been supportive of creating a minimum payment standard in these industries. We just have a disagreement with how that law went about doing it. And so we feel that the new revisions is closer to what we would like to see in a minimum wage law that would restore the orders that have been lost, which would then restore pay. And we believe that the workers will actually earn more under this new revisions than they would have before January 13th anyway. So it's not cutting worker pay from before. It's actually going to increase worker pay from before.
January 13th is when it went into effect this year. Danielle, I know Working Washington was a key partner in passing PayUp 2 years ago. What's your overall reaction to these changes the council's planning to make?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to take a step back to just say what were the conditions like in this industry before we had a pay standard? Why is it so crucial, like Michael says, that we have some regulations in this industry? We had workers earning sub-minimum wages, working with no pay floor, no transparency about the jobs they were taking, and experiencing a lot of pressure to work when it suited the apps and not necessarily when it suited the workers, which is flexibility is such a key part of this industry. So the goal with this policy, which remains our overarching priority, is to make sure that people are paid a living wage that's minimum wage after expenses, that there is transparency for both for customers and for workers, and that people can really continue to choose when they are working, again, which is really so important in this industry. So when we have that as a bottom line, I think our major concern is one that has been proposed by Council President Nelson actually is a pay cut. And I think for us as a bottom line, making sure that workers are not earning sub-minimum wages is just, that is a bright line we can't, as a city, go beyond. And two, that the way the changes have been developed has been done in a really concerning way that has not been transparent or public or brought workers to the table.
Okay, and I'm going to pull apart some of those issues in just a little bit, but I did want to talk a little bit more about what Council President Nelson has been saying here. And here's an excerpt from an April 25th committee meeting on the issue. Council President Nelson was emphasizing the urgency she is feeling to make changes to PayUp. Here's a brief excerpt of what she said.
I don't want to wait for months because people can't pay rent right now, and so that is why I am motivated to do something that will have an immediate impact. And this first in the nation legislation is what caused the chain of events that we're experiencing now. So therefore, I feel that it's incumbent upon us to reverse the unintended consequences that I predicted from the get-go.
So, Danielle, Council President Nelson says she's trying to be pragmatic and act quickly after hearing an outcry from workers and local restaurants about PayUp. How do you respond to that?
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge that this bill passed 9-0, including with the support of Council President Nelson, and reflected the really thoughtful stakeholdering process that brought that policy to the council.
PayUp did in 2022.
PayUp did in 2022.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think what's critical for us is that this law is not what has caused the impacts that we have seen that are concerning to all of us. It's really the app's responses. So in the new imposition of uncontrolled fees on customers is really concerning to us. It is not correlate at all with what workers are making now. It doesn't connect to increased labor costs. It is having a huge impact on customers and local businesses, and we think that it is urgent to address the issue of fees. We are concerned that the proposal that has been put forward does nothing to guarantee the fees will go away. In fact, Council President Nelson has said she hopes that it will be acceptable to the platforms. And so we're in a position now where we're contemplating a first-in-the-nation cut on minimum wage for an industry that desperately needs regulation, with no guarantees that the fees are going to go away, which leaves customers and businesses and workers in a really tough spot. And we really urge the council to take seriously what are some of the mechanisms that could meaningfully address the fees, which would go a long way.
Can I put a pin in the fees point for a second? Because I really wanted to address this with you, Michael, about one point of pushback here, which is we've only had this law on the books for a few months, this whole urgency idea here. We've had this law on the books for a few months. We haven't really let it settle out yet. Some drivers have testified they're doing well with PayUp in place. Is the City Council moving too soon to make changes to PayUp?
I don't think so. And, part of what I want to sort of frame here is the stakeholder process that took place in 2022 was, from our viewpoint and the viewpoint of other people that were in that room, a little one-sided. 95% of the PayUp law was basically the original proposal that Working Washington made to former council member Lisa Herbold. Yeah. And those meetings were not exactly completely collaborative. We started out, Lisa Herbold would introduce and then hand over the gavel effectively to the former executive director of Working Washington, Sage Wilson. Okay. And it was a very sort of one-sided affair. So from our viewpoint, when Councilmember Nelson approached Drive Forward and asked, what changes would you like to make? We sent in a proposal that actually is a little different than what came out in the bill. In fact, had a slightly higher per hour amount and a higher per mileage amount. Okay. But in the negotiations, the company said, in order to remove these fees, we need to change some of these numbers. And so that got negotiated in with Council President Nelson, and that's the result of this revisions. Yeah. So we think that the data side and collection of data is important, and that's why we supported Councilmember Kettle's amendment that would provide for a study, a 1- and 2-year study, so that we can come back and adjust these numbers to make sure that they're correct. The urgency part is if we're having workers and restaurants potentially, for workers, losing housing, losing food support, and for restaurants, we already know of a couple that have gone out of business because of lost orders. You know, this doesn't help Seattle's economy. And so the urgency is to fix something to get these deliveries back up so that we can have workers be paid, restaurants can continue to operate and be able to be profitable, and then study this with real data, which right now we don't have because the companies don't like giving up data. And so let's come back after we get those studies and adjust this if necessary.
Danielle, what do you got?
Just, you know, I think Michael's point about data is really important. It's something that the apps have intentionally withheld, even when council members have requested it. And
Meaning,
so
like, how much are you really losing in terms of business?
And to help them have a,
companies?
you know, to have policymakers have a full sense of, you know, the needs of all of the stakeholders. And I think, you know, we can disagree on how meaningful prior stakeholdering was, but I think if there's a perspective that prior stakeholdering was not effective, to repeat that mistake by having Uber meet with Uber and come up with a policy that then gets produced, it just seems like the council has talked a lot about good governance and data-driven policy, and what has happened so far has been inconsistent with that. And so what we're asking for is a process that really includes all stakeholders, that is data-driven, and that we know about it before policy is introduced. You know, we heard about this after legislation had already been drafted. And so I think that's part of what has been so encouraging for us about the statements from the mayor and from Councilmember Hollingsworth at the committee meeting, identifying the need for more stakeholdering, which we are always very willing to engage with. You know, Working Washington has engaged in stakeholdering for years, coming to rulemaking, coming to council members. I don't think you could meet a group that is more interested in stakeholdering than us. And so I think, again, the data point, especially on what's going on with the fees, I think is really critical. It's having such an impact on all of the Seattle stakeholders that we all care about.
Can you touch on that data, please? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was just going to say, and Drive Forward isn't opposed to this. We would be perfectly happy to sit at a table with Danielle and Working Washington and really discuss these issues to get to a place where we think that this policy, it would be effective. And I don't think that, as I said, the previous stakeholder process really got us to that place. And, you know, there's obviously, as the new city councils come in, it's a different ethos there now. So, you know, I think there is some learning to be done on the new city council too.
Fair enough. And maybe we can get to some of these middle points by talking about the numbers. And Michael, let me stick with you as we talk about what's been proposed in this new legislation. First, it would reduce the pay rate for drivers from 44 cents per minute now, plus 74 cents per mile during orders, to 33 cents per minute and 35 cents per mile. And then there's that minimum $5 per order payment to drivers from PayUp that would be replaced by hourly pay on a weekly basis, topping up drivers to $19.97 per hour, the city's minimum wage, if they earned less than that. Also, drivers would not be paid for trips canceled by the customer. I know there's been a lot of questions about these numbers here, and if I'm misinterpreting something, please let me know here. But could you let me know, how did we get to these numbers? How are they going to help? What do we got here?
Yeah, so I want to sort of clarify one thing, or a couple things. So the true up standard is at the end of the pay period, and that pay period can't exceed 14 days. So, but the companies can do it at a week, which is what their standard is now. I don't imagine they're going to necessarily change that. The companies will have to true up not just to 1997, but also to 35 cents a mile. So that true up is more than minimum wage, and as we know, 1997 is Seattle's minimum wage.
And they're not going to get penalized. They're not going to be brought down to 1997.
And the way the system used to work before PayUp went into effect, the workers would get a guaranteed amount per delivery, and at the end of every week they'd get paid out that guaranteed amount plus their tips. And the way the new law will work is that will be there too. You get the guaranteed amount. If you end up earning more than the true up formula says, you get to keep all that money. So it's a balancing act of allowing the app companies to have some flexibility in how they particularly price an individual offer to both the consumer and to the worker, so that if there's a particular kind of offer that they know the workers generally don't want to accept, they might price that higher to get that to be accepted in a reasonable time frame to then service the customer well.
Okay.
So there's a lot of little nuances in here, and that may be getting into a lot of the weeds.
No, it's an important part of it.
You know, so it's mindful to know that this was the per hour rate was set at Seattle's minimum wage. So for the time worked, they will never earn less than Seattle minimum wage plus 35 cents a mile.
Got it.
In terms of why it came out to that number, our initial proposal to Council President Nelson and the rest of the City Council, the numbers were a little bit higher.
Yeah.
The companies really insisted in those negotiations that they needed to have these numbers there to be able to remove the Seattle regulatory fee.
This $5 fee, right.
And we've received assurances that if it passes as it is, that those fees would go away.
Okay.
So that was the reason why we were reluctantly willing to bring that down.
Fair enough. Let's talk about some of these numbers, Danielle, and I know a lot was brought up there. Wherever you want to go into this, maybe it's that $5 fee and the assurances, I guess, from the companies that this is going to be removed, or where do you want to go in these numbers here? There's a lot to cover.
Yeah, there is a lot to cover. Okay, there's a couple points I want to make. One,
Please.
just to respond on the question of the fees. I think it is really concerning for us, as I've mentioned, to just have assurances that something might happen with no guarantee really is asking us to make guarantees about cuts to worker pay with no guarantee that the trade-off that we're hearing about might actually pan out for everybody else, setting aside if that's a good deal.
Sure.
So, you know, we have seen a lot of success. This issue of fees being charged by these platforms this is not the first time it's coming up. It actually, during the pandemic, was a huge issue because restaurants are also charged fees for using the service.
The council caps the fees during the pandemic, right?
And that's actually permanent now. So that was a policy that was made permanent because people recognize that, yes, it's an important service. It's part of the industry now. Restaurants are using it. It's part of having a successful business now. Customers expect it. And at the same time, the council said, you know, it's appropriate for us to have some parameters about how that service is provided.
Okay.
And so, you know, even though it's a different council, I would think that was a very business supportive policy, and something like a companion policy for customers would do a lot to help businesses right now if that's one of our shared objectives, and also reduce access costs. I want to make a couple very quick points about the pay standard, which I know is complicated, and for people that work in other industries, they're like, why are there all these factors and multiplying and what's this, what's that? So there's a couple things I think that are important to understand. One is, in this industry, workers incur a lot of expenses doing the work. So making sure that people make minimum wage after expenses is one of those like baseline policy principles. So that's why, you know, the formula accounts for payroll tax, the other costs that people incur, right? That if you were an employee at a business, the business would cover. So we want to account for that. And then there's other expenses that people incur. Mileage is a big one.
Yeah.
And you know, the IRS mileage rate is just the standard. It's not like a number invented by any organization. The IRS sets it. You know, the city's own policies say for city contractors, people get mileage.
Yeah.
And so putting that in the policy is really tracking what is a standard that is not specific to this industry. And accounts for the fact that wear and tear on cars and gas and all of that is a huge expense for people, and was one of the main issues people were coming to us before, saying that's how they're ending up losing money at the end of the day.
Can I pull out that number? Because I thought it was very interesting, too, this 35 cents per mile reimbursement that this new version of PayUp is going to have in place. It's well below that IRS standard mileage rate of 67 cents for vehicle wear and tear. Some thoughts about that, Michael?
Yeah, you know, one of the things, I mean, the IRS standard is a good standard as a general standard. And the way the IRS standard is computed, it takes into account the most popular vehicles in America. And, you know, in the last few years, 5-7 years, the top three most popular vehicles in America are the Ford F-150, the Chevy Silverado, and the Dodge Ram.
Yeah.
Of the top 10, there's only one sedan. So most gig workers who are doing this kind of delivery work, which is different from rideshare, aren't using, you know, pickup trucks to do those deliveries.
I sure hope not. There's nowhere to park.
And so the actual costs of drivers in multiple studies done across the nation have shown that the actual expense rate is lower than that IRS standard. And so that's where the 35 cents a mile number, when we did a study of costs back in 2021, it came out at about 35 cents a mile. We proposed to council that it should be at about 43 cents a mile. The companies had a study that said it was 28 cents a mile.
So there's this middle piece. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so that's sort of where that came from. And, you know, again, this is something that, you know, when we were in a room with Sara Nelson and the companies, this is sort of where that led to. Yeah. And again, if we find in the studies in the future, once this legislation hopefully will be adopted, that that's not correct, happy to come back and adjust it.
Okay. Danielle, some thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, doing studies and then coming back and adjusting it means that we have workers who are working in a region with incredibly expensive gas, which is another part of what's counted for, right, with mileage. It's not just what car you're driving, but what expenses you're incurring. Will be left under minimum wage, right? So our assessment of the formula that has been proposed is it will leave people with $13.17 as an hourly rate. Mm-hmm. And, there may be robust perspectives on the numbers and where we should land. But again, one of our underlying concerns is the place to hash that out is not in Council President Nelson's office. That's on the dais to have robust discussion, to have a full stakeholdering process, and to make sure that also other council members have the opportunity to fully engage, right? There's a lot of people who have put a lot of work into understanding this industry, getting up to speed, talking to us, talking to workers, talking to the platforms. It's incredibly complex. Yeah. It's why the process took so long before. And so we would really say that, again, underscores the need for that stakeholdering to happen. And it's so great to hear that, Michael's interested in doing that and can, bring some of that perspective to the table. We really would say that to make sure that we have a policy that is not ending up with the unintended consequence. If it's not the intended consequence, having workers at risk of being back at subminimum wages, I think is such a high risk that it's important that we get to the table and figure out what else has not been resolved enough so that we can have confidence in what we're doing moving forward.
Thanks, and I'll talk about those consequences in just a second, but I just wanted to take a broader industry look here. This was a service, delivery drivers were a service that were used so much during the pandemic because people were not supposed to go out. How is this industry changing? Is there less work with this now that people can actually drive to these restaurants? Maybe they don't want to pay that extra $8 for a burrito, et cetera. Can you give me some insight on this and maybe what workers are telling you too, Danielle? Some thoughts about this. How's this industry changing?
Yeah, I mean, what we've noticed after the pandemic is there's been a number of workers that have gone back to, so during the pandemic, a lot of people, especially if you're a restaurant worker, server, you weren't necessarily still employed. Mm-hmm. Some restaurants managed to continue to pay their employees through the pandemic while they couldn't have people coming in. Yeah. Others didn't. And a lot of people turned to this kind of gig work to be able to make ends meet. Right. And especially in the delivery sector. And the pandemic, I think, was a unique scenario that resulted in being able to really make a living doing this work. Yeah. But since the pandemic, it's been our experience talking with our members that a lot of people who were doing this during the pandemic have now left the industry. And so it's come back down to about the number of workers about where it was prior to. Interesting. But the orders stayed relatively high after the pandemic. And because people got used to doing it, and they liked having their groceries delivered. Sure. And they liked having, the ability to get food from a local pizzeria that doesn't do delivery on their own brought in. Yeah. But as we look ahead and look at what's happened in the rideshare industry when these same kind of standards were put in, the rideshare industry in 2019 in Seattle and King County had over 36 million rides. Yeah. They're now down to 21.5. And when you compare it to the comparable markets across the nation, all the other markets have come at or above their 2019 highs, except for Seattle. Interesting. And so, we can think about the various factors, some of which is we're a tech-heavy city, so there's some work from home. But the other is we're one of the few cities that instituted a minimum pay standard. So we can't say that these don't have effect, right? Okay. They're going to have effect on orders. Orders are going to go down. Okay. The question is the balance going to be where the orders are coming down and the pay is coming up so that drivers end up making more? Okay. That's the balance we need to try and strike.
Fair enough. Can you talk to me about this piece, Danielle? I just wanted to have you respond to what the industry is changing and what workers are telling you about their experience now post-pandemic.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say we have so many members who are saying, I am making a wage where I can support myself now for the first time, not being primarily reliant on tips, having a base pay and not having over 60% of my income coming from tips is a game changer for people. So that is a really important step forward. I think, when we talk about the industry, we don't see this as an industry that's going away. Our perspective is that this is a part of the economy now. The gig model has been around for a while, has expanded to other sectors too. And so our responsibility is to think about how do we make this an industry where people can really support themselves with the same expectations we have of any other work. You know, 10 years ago, when we did the $15 minimum wage, there were people that said that was going to tank the Seattle economy. And it hasn't. It takes some thoughtful stakeholdering and planning to figure out how do you get to a place that can balance the different needs. We put the work into doing that. We had a very robust stakeholdering process with business and labor coming together to figure out a pathway forward. And we really think that that is the very least that Seattle deserves and is able to do. You know, so when we talk about what do we need going forward in this industry, recognizing that there are some people who do it for convenience, but also people who are relying on it as their primary source of income, who are reliant on access to delivery services because they are disabled or otherwise need, you know, additional supports. It's really our goal is to make this an industry where workers and consumers and businesses are all thriving, and we really think that that's possible.
Thank you. We need to start wrapping up here quickly.
Sure, just real quick. And those issues about, you know, we want this to be an industry that is here for a long term, where workers are getting paid fairly, where consumers can do this at affordable price. And also, to a certain extent, you know, the companies have to be able to, you know, make at least a small profit. I mean, that's the whole point of being in business.
Right.
And so it's how do you balance that? And this is where, you know, our fundamental disagreements are, is where you strike that balance. We don't disagree on any of those other points. It's just the fine details where we're really struggling on.
And let's talk about some of those details as we wrap up, because I think Council President Nelson said it, the nation is watching with regard to these changes to PayUp here. And Mike, I'll let you wrap up. What impact do you think changing PayUp will have on delivery drivers here and possibly across the U.S.? I can give you a minute.
You know, I really do think that if these revisions are passed into law, we would see a return to these apps by consumers, and that will hopefully boost up the amount of work that people are doing, and therefore they'll be having more pay. As it stands right now, with this 50% or so drop in orders through on-demand restaurant delivery, you know, we're really seeing workers get hurt. We're seeing pay drop. And we've heard it as the Jason said earlier in the beginning of this segment, you know, $10, $11 an hour. That's well below minimum wage. And we need to figure out how to get back to where we were in terms of demand and increase that pay.
Got it. Danielle, I'll give you the last word here, where you see the app delivery industry going locally and nationally with these proposed changes to PayUp.
Yeah, the proposed changes are really a return to an era in the industry that we don't want to go back to, where workers have no basic labor protections that are really out of step with how we treat any other worker in Seattle. We think it's possible to have a pathway forward. It requires people being willing to put the work in and having leadership from council and the support of the mayor's office to get everybody to the table to have a real process to figure out what is our step forward. But we also know that what we have in front of us is going to be the worst pay standard for gig workers in the country, and I quite frankly think that we deserve a lot better.
All right, we'll see what happens next. Thank you for this, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about Seattle's efforts to change its delivery driver wage laws? One person writes, "I don't pay for delivery anymore because of that ridiculous ordinance. Blame the city for out-of-work drivers, not the corporate entities." Another person comments, "Tell the corporations to eat the costs involved in the ordinance, rather than pass those costs on to drivers, restaurants, and consumers." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on social media. Thank you for that input. Thank you for your input as well. And we'll see you next time on City Inside Out.